Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Humanist Perspective. I'm your host for this evening, Jim Dugan. If you're interested in more information about the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, please visit our website at www.nosha.info. My guest this evening is Daniel Lev Shkolnik. He is a graduate of Yale University and is a humanist speaker and community organizer interested in creating a powerful spiritual alternative to traditional religions. He's a novelist, a poet, an entrepreneur, and on Sunday afternoons, you'll likely find him dancing in the second line. So, Daniel, tell us, what exactly do you do, and what is typewriter poetry?
So, as you can see, I have my typewriter here. His name is Bruno. He's from 1927, Remington, portable number 2. And I write poetry for anybody that comes up and requests a poem. A poem could be anything about any subject. And typically, I've started a typewriter poetry company called Ragtime Poetry Co. So if there are any, basically we do weddings, private parties, corporate events, and the like. And we set up at these events at hotels and elsewhere, as well as on the street. And people come up and we write poems for them.
So where might people see you doing this kind of thing?
Royal Street, and it's not just me as well. There's actually a flourishing typewriter poetry community in New Orleans, but Royal Street is during the day, as well as sometimes in the evenings, and also on Frenchman Street. There tends to be, that's one of the hubs of typewriter poetry in the city.
So Frenchman Street's a very hip, happening kind of place. A lot of music scene, a lot of nightlife, and typewriter poetry. So if I wanted a typewriter poem, I would just show up and say, I want a poem about something.
Yeah, love, your dog, your birthday, those are pretty popular ones. Humanism, the end of the world, the beginning of a new world, whatever you'd like. And but particularly if you're searching for a poem written on Bruno here, the best way to find us is to go to our website, ragtimepoetry.com, or find us on Facebook or Instagram. Also, Ragtime Poetry is the best way to find us there. And you can request a commissioned poem, and we can mail it straight to your address.
And so this is an unusual job. Is this your vocation or your avocation?
This is what I do for money these days. I used to work as a journalist, and I discovered that this is another way to use writerly talents to make a living. The typewriter poetry company is an extension of that.
So I have read some of your stuff on Pathos, for example, about nothingness and humanism and life and death and religion and what does it all mean kind of stuff. You're not doing that right now.
I'm coming back to it now. It's taking a small hiatus, but yeah, my work can be found on Patheos as well.
And so one of the things that you've compared this to in some unusual ways is the tarot card readers that you'll find, which is also part of the street scene in New Orleans, maybe a little bit more in Jackson Square. And there's similarities and there's differences. How do you see that connect?
Yeah, so it's a similar concept. You come up to somebody, and there's a table separating the two. But what is on the table is very different. Tarot card readers have their cards, their crystals, and the like. And I have my typewriter. But essentially, we're providing two fairly similar and analogous services. Tarot card readers, they pull cards from the deck and they purport to essentially they're providing a reflection to the person of themselves, and it's an imaginary reflection of their future, their past, their current predicament in the universe. And that's actually exactly what the typewriter poetry does, except it doesn't purport to take its authority and insight from supernatural powers or principles. I write my poems based on what I know about humanity, what I know about human history, and I try as best as I can to empathize with that particular person that's in front of me, what they may need in that moment to hear, what they need to have a poem about.
So certainly I would imagine that mediums, psychics, tarot card readers, whatever, are trying to intuit some of those things. They're trying to read someone they don't really know. They're trying to pick up on cues, signals, hints about what is going on with that person at that time, and you feel you do some of those same kinds of things?
Yeah, sometimes. There's something called cold reading, which is when a psychic, basically, there are various strategies in which they can reliably, more or less, guess what somebody's past is like, what they're currently struggling with, and there are various strategies involved with cold reading. With poetry, similarly, we don't know who this person is. They simply walk up to us, and we've maybe have a brief conversation with them about their subject, but really we don't know anything about them. So how do you write a poem about love for somebody that you've never met? You don't know how they love or what their history is. But interestingly enough, human life is rather predictable. And
I was going to say drearily predictable.
I wouldn't say drearily predictable, but it is comfortably predictable. And you can use many of the same techniques as cold readers use to intuit and guess what it may be that this person is dealing with, looking at the typical narratives that people go through: heartbreak, recovery, kind of redemption in their lives, forgiveness. All these things are really very universal human experiences, and putting them into a poetic framework to reflect back at the person that's coming to you, they find that actually very powerful to see their lives reflected back at them.
Now, for me, if I were to try to do something like that, it would probably take me like a day. I would have to think about it. I'd have to smith the language. You don't have that kind of time to do this. So where is that just your creative skill, just to be able to snap that stuff out?
It's partly the pressure. So in terms of, most people think that's the hardest thing about typewriter poetry is they look at from a single word, 3, 4, 5 minutes later you have a complete and readable poem in your hands. Many people say, like you, it would take me days, to write a poem. But when you have somebody standing right in front of you and you can't delete on your typewriter, then it forces you to think on your feet, and It turns out that with a little bit of practice, it's actually not as difficult as most people think to start and finish a poem in a few minutes. Making it good is more difficult. That takes practice.
I didn't think about that aspect of it, that you're not doing this in a word processor, you're doing this on paper with a typewriter, so once a word is on the page, it's forever.
Yeah. No, there's no backspace, there's no whiteout. That's part of the medium, and it helps to write quickly, and it helps also to it's almost like a type of jazz.
Mm-hmm. So and now from what you just said though, that's not the hardest aspect of this. What's the hardest aspect of it?
The hardest aspect is trying to find new ways of writing your 1001st poem about love. You're trying to figure out new ways to write a poem about somebody's dog, and there's strangely it's really most people, 80% maybe, want poems about seemingly mundane things, but things that in reality are very important to them: family, love, anniversaries, birthdays, dogs. But it's challenging sometimes to find new ways.
Keep it fresh.
To keep it fresh. Yeah. We don't write the same love poem again and again and again. Everyone is different.
And you find this rewarding in some way?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. And the most rewarding is when somebody comes to the typewriter and they're really struggling with something. They've lost someone dear to them. They are struggling with cancer. They are trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces of their lives and start over. These questions are real human questions. They're not, and the poems themselves are likewise real human poems that people really look to sometimes in times of despair. One woman in particular, I remember in Boston when I was writing there, I wrote her a poem, and afterwards she came back and she embraced me, and she had tears in her eyes. And later she found me online. She said, like, I framed your poem. It's sitting in my room, and I just read it over and over again. And I just want to thank you so much, because I was just hanging by a thread, and I had nobody to turn to. I was losing hope in my life, and there you were, and you delivered this message that really has kept me going.
So there's a therapeutic side of this.
Absolutely.
So now this program we're supposed to be talking about something to do with humanism in some sense. How do we make that connection?
Yeah, so I myself am a humanist, and in stories like that where people are really struggling and trying to make sense of their lives, I try as the best I can to tap into those values that I hold dear as a humanist. And it's not that I throw scientific formulas at them. That's not something that
that's not going to work. That's not going to be very therapeutic.
No, unfortunately not. But what people do need is empathy. People need hope. People need to feel like their life has some sort of purpose, and that is what I strive to provide in the poems.
So how do you do that in the godless, ultimately meaningless void in which we live, the reality of life and death and all that? The answer is not just 42. How do you make where's the hope part?
Right. Well, so that has a lot to do actually with storytelling and with narratives. And I think it's often people think that spirituality and science, and the scientific way of life, they don't have much to do with one another. But when I think about spirituality, really what I think of it as has to do with the human spirit. and it has to do with inspiration, and it has to do with all of the unprovable and fundamentally non-scientific aspects of human life. As much as we are discovering about the world today, as much as we understand that evolution has not put us here for any clear purpose, and we're not going towards any clear end, we still have these human capacities for connection, a sense of unity, a sense of love. And these things are not going to be replaced by any new theories that science can create. These things are inherently unscientific. And as much as we will learn about the universe, we also have to keep in mind that the human heart, the human emotional system, all of which gives us our sense of security and safety in this world, it's based on narratives, it's based on stories, it's based on human connection. And these are the reasons why I think things like art, things like poetry, things like writing, they're never going to go away, they're never going to not be relevant to human beings, because you can describe exactly how the human mind produces the feeling of love or sadness or any number of emotions, but it doesn't mean that we can stop feeling love or sadness, or it doesn't replace the lived experience of being a human being.
So if I'm following you here, so when you say spiritual, you're really talking about the transpersonal, about things that connect, the sense of connection that one person has with another. Am I on the right track? And that one of the ways we do that is through narrative, that is through storytelling. When we share stories, we're sharing images, ideas about what things mean and how we connect and how we feel.
Yeah, in large part, yes. Spirituality is a very complicated topic. So it's a word that has many definitions, and in the cognitive science of religion, researchers have various different definitions of spirituality and of religion, and there's no real consensus about what spirituality really is. But it is, we can study it, and psychologists are studying it, and they have been for the past 100 years or more. William James famously wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he looked very concretely at all the various examples of religious behavior, from mystics to saints to born-again Christians and the like. And he was really, we've come a long way since then, but we are able to study these phenomenon because they are grounded in psychology. They're grounded in sociology. They are intersubjective realities. Intersubjective meaning it's there's objective realities like the existence of this table or the sun, and I can pretend like it's the sun. It doesn't exist, but if I go outside, it doesn't mean it's not going to burn me. It will. But subjective realities are personal, things that we feel only for ourselves. Intersubjective realities, though, are things that exist between people. The fact that money has value is a reality, but only because both you and I believe in money. And there is, a similar thing that happens with religious belief and spiritual belief, and also narrative. We today think that we are maybe beyond these kinds of narratives that we see clearly now that the reign of religion is clearing. But in reality, we still do have many narratives, and they are the things that bond society together. The narrative of the United States as a nation. That's something that helps us cooperate. It's something that helps us live together, produce crops and industry, and keep our a military functioning in the government. And there's also the narrative of human rights, which has become a kind of new creed in the 20th and 21st century. That, especially after the horrors of World War II, where we felt like there needs to be lines, that kind of ethical lines that everyone can agree on, and the sanctity of human beings is among them. But it is, at the end of the day, a story, and it's a narrative that science can't support or disprove.
But as you say, we have many stories that we share. I like that word, actual intersubjectivity, right? Because each of us has inside of us a subjective reality, right? We make our own, there's a set of meanings, presumptions, ideas that are in our heads that structure the reality around us. And our ability to cooperate, connect, share with other people is in part based in some overlap. Our subjectivities are separate, but maybe we kind of can align some things. And we do that in part by telling stories that we share. Our culture has all kinds of stories, right? It has stories about race, gender, history, nationhood, you mentioned, and some other things like that, in a way, narratives can create a reality, right? Or at least a perception of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is, I think there's a lot of people that are questioning, or saying that we need new narratives today, that the old narratives that have bonded human beings to create empires, go on crusades or and whatnot. The old religious narratives, they're in some ways, in many ways, falling apart. And there is this kind of lament that we hear that we live in a godless age, and also what's the point in doing many things, like there's a kind of incipient nihilism about the scientific worldview, and if you just take the world as a kind of neutral plane that is inherently devoid of meaning, it is very useful for understanding the world. It's very useful, for making sense of it scientifically, but it isn't very useful for creating human meaning and creating a sense of human purpose and direction. And for that, there are other means, and philosophy. Various wisdom traditions, from Buddhism to Judaism, even Christianity, all of these are various means of creating stories that give human beings meaning, sense of purpose and direction. The question is, can we create stories that gel with the scientific narrative, that don't contradict it, but really are inspired by it, and really function together with it.
So one question I would have then is how do you bring that back down to poetry? You have a short snippet of something of immediate relevance to an individual. I wouldn't quite call that a narrative, right? Like a narrative is a bigger picture that ties a lot of different elements together, gives a bigger meaning, but a few lines of poetry. I don't know how long is a typical poem when you do it?
It's about yay long, about 20 lines, 25 lines. How is that part of weaving a narrative? Yeah, so it's the poems that I write. They're kind of little sparks of narrative. They reference narratives that already exist in the world, and they remind people of them. So they remind maybe fathers of the purpose of and value of fatherhood, mothers of motherhood. Those seeking to discover something new and establish themselves, the kind of worth of that human endeavor. These are kind of working, but poetry and art in general. It's not necessarily a source of new narratives so much as it is a kind of precipitation of old ones. That kind of really poetry and art has throughout the ages been a medium for conveying various religious narratives, and it really is a good way of inspiring us to I guess, carry out those and see through the life that we have, as a society imagined for ourselves, the kind of the hero's journeys that we value. It reminds us and keeps us on track and keeps us believing in those.
So when you start talking about hero's journeys, now you're going into mythology directly. This is a title of one of Joseph Campbell's books on mythology, The Hero with 1,000 Faces and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So drawing on some of that kind of imagery, which is in some ways, these are just built into human nature, right? You can be as scientific as you want, but to some degree, your brain responds to certain kinds of images and archetypes, no matter what you want to do.
Yeah, there is our brains seem very, very wired for storytelling. The way that we have evolved over the past tens and hundreds of thousands of years. And so I think that really the thing to do is to embrace this, as we have been for millennia, but see if we can combine it with the kind of scientific understanding that we're discovering. It's not exactly easy. The scientific stories are not thrilling, precisely because there are no humans. There are very few humans in the history of the universe. It's only in the last flash of earthly history that we have any humans at all, as opposed to most mythology, which is centered on gods and human-like beings, which are much more exciting to the human brain than are quantum mechanics and the evolution of reptilian organisms into modern.
Well, we have just about 1 minute left. What would you like to tell our audience about embracing their natural desire for narratives?
Well, I'd say it's important to clarify what your personal hero's journey is. Trying to understand what is your heroic self? What is the self that you want to embody? And live uncompromisingly in that direction. I think that there are so many ways in which to live a life, and it doesn't seem like science tells us that one is wrong or one is right. But I think that is fundamentally the place where we take our meaning. And I think that every person has a right to pursue and embody their heroic self.
Daniel Lev Shkolnik, thank you so much for your contribution this evening. It's been an interesting discussion about poetry, meaning, stories, narrative, and old typewriters. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely.